Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today we're taking a look at the K9 Pro ESS from FiiO. This is basically their flagship all-in-one device, and whilst not always being a fan of all-in-ones, I was keen to see how the K9 performed after being quite impressed with the previous generation K5. Before getting into the review, I want to say a huge thanks to Apos Audio for making this review possible, sending me out the K9 Pro ESS. And so I will be linking through to them below. They are an affiliate of the channel, but it doesn't change my ability to see the pros and the cons of this product, as you'll see shortly. The K9 Pro retails for $850 US, making it a fair investment, but still quite affordable in the scheme of things. You could buy yourself one of these for the same price or less than you might pick up a Topping A90 and D90 stack or an equivalent SMSL stack. So on paper it looks like good value. Sometimes putting everything into the one chassis means trade-offs, and that was part of what I was keen to explore. Now something I do want to flag very early on is that I haven't heard the K9 Pro AKM version, so I can't compare the two. That said, I've got a whole bunch of comparisons coming, so make sure you watch all the way through if you want to see how the K9 Pro ESS stacks up to all sorts of different competition, or of course you can use the chapter markers down below to jump around the content as you want to. For now though, let's take a close look at the K9 Pro ESS. To get things started, let's talk about some of the features and benefits of the K9 Pro. First of all, it uses a pair of DAC chips to completely separate the left and right channels, and that also therefore allows it to be fully balanced. That's nothing new, the old AKM version was as well I believe, but it's a different approach now as I understand it by having the two chips instead of one. The original AKM version was still balanced, but theoretically having the separate chips handle the separate channels can lead to even better channel separation. Paired up with that DAC stage is a THX 788 Plus amp. Now what that means, if you haven't heard about the THX technology before, is it means it measures very well. Theoretically, it's a very clean, extremely low distortion amp. In practice, the THX designs and similar nested feedback designs sometimes result in a less than enjoyable, somewhat artificial and sterile sound. So that was one of my questions coming into this review, was does the amp stage suck the life out of the K9 Pro ESS, or is it actually a good example of a nested feedback design? We will of course get to the sound quality in the fullness of time, but there's still a few features to go through because this thing is jam-packed. It's got its own inbuilt linear power supply, so for fans of linear power supplies or those that don't like switch mode power supplies, the K9 Pro ESS, as I understand it, is running its own internal transformer. It also offers Bluetooth, but more importantly than that, it offers all the different codecs. So you've got LDAC, aptX HD, aptX Adaptive, everything you could want to get the best possible sound from a Bluetooth signal being sent to the K9 Pro ESS. It also has full MQA capability if that's something you're interested in. Let's say you're listening to Tidal as your streaming source, this will do MQA for you, no problems at all. And in terms of amplification power, it's got plenty. The K9 Pro ESS will put out about 2.1 watts into 32 ohms, regardless of whether you're using single-ended or balanced. The figures are slightly different and slightly more from balanced, but it's pretty similar on both. Where that changes a bit though is if you are using higher impedance headphones, let's say you've got a pair of 300 ohm HT6XX or similar, the K9 Pro is going to put out 1.1 watt via the balanced connection and only 281 milliwatts via the single-ended. That's not a big deal though, because there's still plenty of power there to drive any 300 ohm headphone that I've come across to good solid listening levels. So in short, the K9 Pro here can drive every headphone under the sun. Whether or not it's a good pairing with those headphones, that's a bit of a different question, but it has the power available. I will talk about drivability of both difficult headphones and very sensitive IEMs shortly, But before we do, I want to cover off just a couple of gripes that I've got about the K9 Pro ESS. The first one for me is kind of a non-issue at all, but I know for some people it's important. The K9 Pro will handle DSD, high sample rate PCM, all of the super duper high-res formats. This has got handled no problems via USB. But when you switch over to coaxial and optical, all of a sudden it's very, very limited in bandwidth. You can run 192 kHz as your maximum into the coaxial, and the optical's capped at just 96 kHz. The reason I raise that is that in the current market, most devices now are handling DSD and high sample rate PCM through all digital inputs. I've only just recently reviewed the AUN X1 SGT, which is a more budget version of an all-in-one like this, and that handled high-res sample rates on both coaxial and optical. So I was kind of shocked when the K9 Pro ESS didn't. As I said, for me it's a non-event because 192 kHz is plenty for all the different streaming services that I use. I'm not really into SACD and DSD, so that side of things didn't worry me too much. But for any of you that are into DSD, are into high sample rates, and you do want to use coaxial or optical, the K9 Pro ESS isn't going to be good for you. If you're happy to use USB and Bluetooth, that's where things are really strong in the K9 Pro. It'll handle everything you can think of through USB, and the same can be said for Bluetooth. While we're talking gripes and USB, another thing I want to mention is that when you switch away from the USB source, it switches off the USB circuit. Now often that's done to remove any potential noise being brought into the system through the USB circuit, but what it also means is it's going to drop out the connection from your computer and become invisible. So every time you switch back to USB, there's a bit of a lag when the unit switches on, the computer sees the device, and it has to do the handshake again. Not a big deal, but it's a little bit fiddly sometimes. My final gripe with the K9 Pro ESS from a design point of view is the labelling of the switches on the front panel. Down the bottom of the front panel here, we've got 4 different switches. And there is some labelling on the front panel, but unless you've got a bright light shining directly on the unit, there is no way you can read it from a distance. Of course, over time, you kind of get used to which switch is which and which position is which, but I don't like the fact that you've really got to look closely when you first start using the product unless it's in a brightly lit location, nice and easy to see. Now, speaking of those switches and functionality and options and being able to see what's going on, something I haven't yet mentioned is that the K9 Pro ESS has its very own companion app. And so you can control a lot of what the K9 Pro ESS does via that app. Using Android or iPhone, you can connect up your phone to the ESS Pro via Bluetooth, and this works regardless of whether you're actually sending music via Bluetooth. So if you've got a USB connection, coaxial, optical, etc., you can connect up to the K9 Pro via the app and change all sorts of settings. There are filter settings which do make a decent difference on the K9 Pro. You can also add EQ settings for those that want to use EQ. You can change balance, which is fantastic for anybody with any unilateral hearing loss. And then there's also some cosmetic functionality with things like changing the ring light around the volume control to have it constantly move through different colors or show which sample rate you're listening to. So it is a really nice addition having that companion app, giving you that control, particularly as I said before, for users of EQ. And in my experience, the app worked very, very well. It was pretty seamless. So I'm not going to carry on about the app too much. It's not a big selling feature in my opinion, but it's great that it's there. For me, what's more important is which headphones and earphones you can use this with and how they're going to sound when you do. So let's start with drivability. I said before that this has plenty of power for anything under the sun. And one of my tests for that, as always, was to plug in the HiFi and Sesfara. Using high gain and the balanced output, the K9 Pro was humming along nicely at about 60% volume. What that means is you've got plenty of headroom available, you're not pushing this to its limits, and the sound was great. It's not a device I would necessarily recommend for the Sesfaras. I believe they deserve a higher level source chain, but it sounded completely fine and I wouldn't complain a bit. More importantly though, what that tells us is that every other headphone on the planet is going to be completely fine with this device, except electrostats of course, because they need their own energizer. At the other end of the scale with IEMs, I love the gain implementation on the K9 Pro. In low gain, it pulls heaps of power out of the unit and gives you massive amounts of volume range when you're using sensitive IEMs. And that's really important because if you've got any channel imbalance down low on the bottom of the volume control, you can get way out of that before you reach listening levels. And that means you can easily adjust the listening level without worrying about getting back into channel imbalance. In fact, I didn't even test channel imbalance on the K9 Pro ESS because I was so far from the bottom of the dial. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. The setup here is brilliant. If you're using IEMs, you use low gain mode. If you're using sensitive headphones, medium's great. So with headphones like the Meza Elites, the Beyerdynamic DT900 Pro X, the Rode NTH100s, which I've got coming for review soon, all of those work really happily in medium gain. And then you've got high gain available for more power-hungry headphones, some of the difficult planar magnetics, high impedance headphones, etc. So it's a very, very versatile device in terms of what it can drive. And then the question, of course, is how does it sound when it's driving them? And that's a slightly difficult question because there is so much going on with the K9 Pro ESS. And in fact, I probably should give you a really quick tour of the unit to explain just what is going on. On the front panel, things are pretty simple. We've got 3 outputs. You've got a 4-pin XLR, which is actually covered by a blanking plate when you first receive the unit. You've also got a 6.3mm single-ended output and a 4.4mm balanced as well. You've got this beautiful volume control in the middle that's got a lovely smooth turning feel and lots of range, as I've already talked about. And then you've got some indicator lights to tell you the source that you're using. And down the bottom of the panel, you've got 4 switches. You've got a power switch, the input selection switch, a 3-step gain control low, medium and high, and a selection switch to choose between headphone output, DAC output, which is a fixed line out, and preamp output, which applies volume control to the outputs. On the back here, we've got a pair of XLR outputs that can go to a balanced amplifier. We've also got a pair of RCA outputs and a pair of RCA inputs, so you can run an auxiliary line into this, say from a turntable should you want to. There's also a 4.4mm balanced input if you want to. And then we've got our digital inputs via a Bluetooth antenna, a USB-B socket, coaxial and optical. Finally, there's a standard IEC connector over here, which, as I said, is going to feed the internal power supply. So there's nothing too groundbreaking here. It's got all the connections that you'd expect, none of the ones you maybe wouldn't expect, but that means there were plenty of ins and outs and different options for me to consider. And so when it comes to sound, let me start off by saying that the K9 Pro ESS is clean, articulate and enjoyable. It's not, thankfully, at all sterile. It's not a particularly organic or rich sounding device, but to me it just sounds right. It's neutral, it's clean, it sounds like a high quality, good measuring amplifier that hasn't drifted into sterility. There's a really good sense of separation and image clarity in what is overall a fairly flat soundstage, but with a good sense of width. That does change slightly depending on the filter that you choose, but it's never going to get particularly deep. When listening to it in isolation, I felt like there was no specific coloration or tonality from the amp, and or the DAC for that matter, because I was listening to it as an all-in-one. And that's generally a good thing. You don't often want too much coloration coming from your DAC and your amp, particularly from your DAC. And if you're buying a device like this, you probably want something pretty neutral. If you want to add warmth and richness, you can always tack on a secondary amplifier to give you that flavour. But as an all-in-one device, I think it's the right choice to get something pretty neutral, and then you can choose coloration through your headphones or EQ if you want to. I also, of course, did a quick comparison between the balanced and the single-ended outputs, and the difference was minimal, but there was a slight difference. I feel like the balanced output has just a little bit more clarity, separation, and that leads to a slightly wider sense of space in the soundstage, but it wasn't night and day, and that's great. This is one of those devices where you can happily use it single-ended and or balanced and not feel like you're trading off a lot if you're not using balanced. There's no doubt in my mind that balanced is slightly superior, but it's not a big enough difference to worry about if you've got some single-ended headphones and you want to use this as your one device for everything. Having covered off the sound in isolation though, I then started to look at how each individual component within the K9 Pro was performing, and that meant starting by isolating just the DAC. Now for this test, I've only used the USB connection. There was so much ground to cover for this review that I couldn't start breaking it down into whether coax was different to optical, different to USB, etc. So all of my testing here is focused on USB, and honestly, given the specs I stated before about the coaxial and optical, USB and Bluetooth are really the best ways to use this anyway. On top of that, in all my recent tests of modern DACs, I'm finding there is less and less difference between coax, optical and USB, and so I've also gone on the assumption that it's going to be pretty similar between all three. As part of my DAC test, I rolled through the different filters available for the K9 Pro ESS, and as I said before, I like the fact that there is a noticeable difference using those filters on this one. There are some DACs I've tried where the differences are very, very subtle, but I feel like it's a little bit clearer from the K9 Pro ESS just what it's doing. It's not going to transform the DAC from a thick, warm, spacious sounding DAC into something super neutral and sterile, but it will ever so slightly shift the sense of space and the sense of attack from the sound. My three favourites after going through were the apodizing fast roll-off filter, as well as the fast roll-off and slow roll-off filters. None of the filters were bad, but I felt like they were probably the three best. Slow roll-off gives you a slightly larger sense of space in the soundstage, very, very minor though. It also takes a little bit of attack out of the front edge of the notes. And then the apodizing and the fast roll-off are both pretty similar, with apodizing maybe having just a slightly smoother attack, but still having a good sense of articulation, and maybe ever so slight greater sense of space as well. But it is very minor a difference between fast and apodizing, and slow roll-off is still not a drastic difference either. And so sticking with the apodizing fast roll-off filter, I moved on to compare the DAC in the K9 Pro ESS with the Soncoz SGD-1. Now I've got a review coming up soon for the SGD-1, so if you're interested in that one, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. That's coming down the pipeline soon. And if you want to know what else is coming down the pipeline, channel patrons get access to my full review schedule, so they see everything as I receive it. It goes into the schedule, they can see when it's coming up. There's lots of other benefits as well, of course, so check out the link down below through to Patreon if you're interested in getting to know more about the channel, having more contact and being able to ask more questions of me, all that sort of fun stuff. It's all explained on Patreon. For now though, let's talk about the K9 Pro up against the Soncoz SGD-1, with the K9 Pro working purely as a DAC. So for this test, I connected both the K9 Pro and the SGD-1 via XLR cables into the Burson Soloist 3XP. The DAC from the K9 Pro ESS, to my ears, is very clean and a little bit sterile. With a track like Blame It on Kane by Elvis Costello, I felt like things were just edging on a bit of fatigue, a little bit over-aggressive was the sound from the K9 Pro ESS. It wasn't to the point of being unenjoyable, but it wasn't exceptionally enjoyable either. In contrast, the $480 SGD-1, which is only a DAC, that produced a sound which I felt was a bit more spacious, it was a bit smoother, but it was still highly detailed and to me, a slightly better sounding DAC. I should also mention that I matched the filters between them. They both offer the same ESS apodizing fast roll-off filter. So it was a level playing field, but I felt like the SGD-1 was just a bit smoother and just a little bit more enjoyable overall. Having said that, the K9 Pro delivered a slightly better sense of bass impact. And I think what was going on was that the K9 Pro was actually overall a more dynamic DAC. So it's got a bit more punch in the bass, it's got a bit more attack in the top end, but the end result of that can be both a more dynamic and therefore exciting sound, but also potentially a more fatiguing sound as well if you're using it as a DAC, depending on the amp and the headphones you use. When you're using it as an all-in-one, that's kind of negated by the way it's tuned together with the amp, and I'll get to that shortly. But if you are looking to use this ultimately as your DAC, do be aware that it is quite an aggressive sound. Not in a bad way, but it does have a bit of extra attack. Possibly moving over to something like the slow roll-off filter would help that a bit, but again, with all the ground to cover, I didn't try to optimize things, I just tried to match them like for like with the SGD-1 and give you some sense of how it sounds. And so that of course leads to the question, given that it is an all-in-one, and most people I think are going to buy it as an all-in-one, the next question was, how does the amp stage perform in isolation? And so on this occasion, I used the K9 Pro DAC for everything and listened to the K9 Pro's internal amp taking the feed from its DAC as one option, and the other option was I took XLRs out of the K9 Pro and into the SMSL HO200. For this test, I was using Brooklyn Heights by Down to the Bone, and flipping back and forth between the K9 Pro's amp and the HO200 amp, what I found was that the presentation from both amps was very, very similar. Before I get into the details, one thing I want to flag is that the gain implementation from the K9 Pro ESS is way better than the HO200. When I was using IEMs, I got plenty of range out of low gain, and then when I went to the Mesa Elites, I was getting plenty of range out of medium gain using the K9 Pro ESS. But with the HO200, I tend to use low gain for everything. And so what that means is you're getting a little bit less volume range available for something like the IEMs, and then medium gain becomes a little bit irrelevant because you're jumping to high gain for difficult headphones and low gain for everything else. So I love the way the gain is implemented on the K9 Pro. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Coming back to the sound presentations though, in comparing the HO200 and the K9 Pro ESS, I felt like the HO200 was a little bit flatter sounding, and I mean that spatially, and also a little bit less dynamic or less energetic than the K9 Pro, and I mean that in not such a good way. So even though the DAC in the K9 Pro can get a little bit aggressive for me, I think the amplifier is doing a wonderful job of just taming it in the right ways and keeping it under control. The HO200 is a nice solid amp. If you've seen my review for it, I got to the end and said pretty much that. It's good, it's not amazing, but it's solid. I think the amp inside the K9 Pro is a little bit better. On the track I referred to, Brooklyn Heights by Down to the Bone, I felt like the K9 Pro did a better job of separating out the sounds. So the percussion and the main instruments in that track were better separated. It was easier for me to hear each individual part while still producing a coherent whole. I felt like the K9 Pro also had a bit more drive in the bass, and all of the leading edges of notes were just a little bit clearer and crisper without getting overly aggressive. So the amplifier here has tamed the DAC a little bit, but not tamed it as much as something like the HO200 did. I think for those with particularly aggressive headphones or those that like a smoother sound, there might be an argument for something like the HO200 with the K9 Pro, but for me, I think they've done a wonderful job at FiiO of pairing the right sort of amp design and tuning with the DAC that's in the unit. And the end result is a very enjoyable, well-balanced sound that's both dynamic and energetic, but not overly aggressive and therefore fatiguing. As a little side note, I did also run a line input into the K9 Pro, taking a feed from the Soncoz SGD-1 via RCA, and I thought the sound using the line in was still very, very good. The K9 Pro added a slight sense of smoothness to the sound, which makes sense given that it's taming the internal DAC a little bit, but it wasn't so much that it became in any way mushy or overly smooth. It just showed that it does have a slightly smooth character despite being a THX measurement-focused super clean amp. And so again, I think it's a great pairing, and both the DAC and the amp together make for a very enjoyable unit. But to wrap things up once and for all and really put this into context, I've got two different all-in-ones that I want to compare with the K9 Pro. The first one is the cheaper Topping DX5, which I've also got coming for review very soon. And the DX5 retails for $449 US, making it a good solid $400 less than the K9 Pro. Putting aside features and stuff like that, I'll cover that off in the DX5 review. Comparing these two purely on sound, I felt like the K9 Pro had just a slightly more natural sense of tonality and timbre in things like vocals, instrumentals. It was just a little bit more what I would call organic. The track I was using for this test was Good Love by Lucy Pearl, and I felt like from the DX5 I was getting all of the details just slightly over-enhanced. It wasn't bad by any stretch, but this is what I mean about the K9 Pro ESS coming across just more natural. There was lots of detail and texture from both devices on things like the vocals and the backing vocals, but from the K9 Pro ESS it just sounded more real and more lifelike, whereas the DX5 just made it sound a little tiny bit over-enhanced, like the contrast had been turned up just a touch too much. As I listened more and more, one of the things I found, and I don't know if this is accurate what I'm about to say, but it sounded like the K9 Pro was allowing just a little bit more decay in the sound, whereas the DX5 was clipping the sounds off. It was just a little bit too quick to chop the ends off notes and make everything very clipped and sort of over-articulate, whereas the K9 Pro ESS gave it space and time to breathe, and that made it sound more natural. Again, I don't know if that's actually what was going on sonically and technically, but it was the listening experience that I got. Now I should be clear here, I'm splitting hairs between these two. If you only have a $450 budget and the K9 Pro is out of your range, make sure you subscribe to check out my review of the DX5. I do think it's a great device. I'm not going to say it's perfect, you'll have to wait for the review on that one because I haven't spent enough time with it yet. But on pure sonic performance, it's a very solid device and it falls just a little bit short, but not a long way short, of the K9 Pro. Having said that, if you do have the money to spare, the K9 Pro is clearly the better device. And so that had me looking for a product that was at a similar price point, but offering also similar features. And that led me to a sort of competitor in the Chord Mojo 2. Now I say a sort of competitor because it has nowhere near all of the features of the K9 Pro ESS. It's not a desktop style device, there's no balanced, it's got no Bluetooth, and it's nowhere near as powerful. But at $700 US, it is a very high performance all-in-one DAC-Amp combo that also happens to offer features like crossfeed and EQ. So I was keen to see how it compared. Using the track All My Friends by Counting Crows, the K9 Pro came across as immediately more energetic, and it brought everything closer to me as the listener, which helped me sort of focus in more on the vocals. On the other hand, going to the Mojo 2, it produced a better sense of depth in the soundstage. It also produces a greater sense of space between the listener and the music. It doesn't push everything a long way away, but just enough that you feel a bit more sense of overall space. And it allowed me to hear that the drums in the recording are actually behind the singer, which with the K9 Pro ESS, things were all pretty level. It's got that sort of normal flat soundstage approach that most Sabre, AKM, other chip-based Delta Sigma DACs tend to produce. Interestingly, having just come from the DX5 comparison, where the DX5 was just a bit overdone and a bit less natural, I felt like the tables turned in this one. The Mojo 2 was now the one that, to me, sounded just a bit more natural and organic in its sound, whereas now the K9 Pro, in contrast, started to sound a little bit overdone in terms of the detail and the contrast. Now that doesn't mean that the Mojo 2 is smoothing everything off, it's just allowing everything to sound a bit more natural and a bit more organic overall. Whereas the K9 Pro does show in contrast and context that it has a little tiny hint of that artificialness and sterility that often comes from these nested feedback designs. That's not a knock on the K9 Pro though, it's a wonderful sounding device, but in comparison of the two devices, the Mojo 2 does just get the edge in terms of its natural presentation of sounds. To give you a specific example of that, in All My Friends, I feel like the K9 Pro was just pushing the cymbals a little bit too much at me. Whereas when I listened to it on the Mojo 2, it was balancing them better within the overall mix. It was putting them behind the main features like the vocals and other key instruments. And so there was still lots of detail and clarity, but it wasn't pushed at me and overemphasized. Another thing that I found was that the K9 Pro, in comparison to the Mojo 2, was a narrower soundstage. It's got overall what I would call a good sense of width, but it's not as wide or as deep as the Mojo 2 can deliver. In All My Friends, there's a bit of a climactic moment in the music at around about the 2-minute mark, and what I found was that when things got busier and more dramatic and more energetic, the K9 Pro ESS did come across just a little bit too energetic and a bit too forceful on that particular track, and based on the volume I was listening to for the beginning of the track, things got not as enjoyable as I would like. It wasn't unenjoyable, but it was at a point where I was thinking about turning the volume down. With the Mojo 2, I didn't have that problem. So starting listening at the same volume, as that crescendo came in and things picked up and got busier, I didn't ever feel any discomfort from the Mojo 2, I was just able to enjoy the journey in the music. So I do think the K9 Pro, as I said before, has just a hint of that artificial nature, but it's still a wonderful, wonderful device. And so to be really clear, what I'm saying here is that if sound quality and only sound quality is your key, then the Mojo 2, I think, might be the better choice. But if you're looking for feature set, if you're looking for a desktop unit that's going to be mains powered, take full-size USB, give you Bluetooth functionality without spending more on an add-on, give you the phone app if you want to interact with it and change things, if you want all those sorts of features, the K9 Pro ESS is clearly the better device than the Mojo 2, but on sound quality, I'd rate the Mojo 2 as maybe, let's call it an 8.5 out of 10, and I'd call the K9 Pro probably an 8 or a 7.5 out of 10. And that would depend on the track I was listening to on the day and my mood, so somewhere in that 7.5 to 8 range, and then the Mojo 2 just a little bit higher again. Now as always, they're arbitrary numbers, so don't put too much meaning into that over and above the direct comparison of these two devices. But my point is, they're pretty close overall, with a slight edge going to the Mojo 2. Having said that, and to bring all of this to a close, I've been really, really impressed by the K9 Pro ESS. It's actually become my new go-to device sitting under my desk here for all of my general purpose editing, mixing, a bit of game playing, movie watching, all of those sorts of things. The K9 Pro ESS is a fantastic device. It's not going to be replacing things like the shit Yggdrasil or the Chord TT2 anytime soon for music listening, but for other general purpose listening where it's more about the feature set, the convenience, and it's not all about the sound quality, the K9 Pro ESS is absolutely wonderful. And that's not a knock on the K9 Pro ESS. My point is it doesn't and it shouldn't stack up to multi-$1,000 devices when it's an $850 all-in-one. I think at that price, it's incredible value, and it easily stacks up with a DAC and amp combo of separates in a similar price range. But it comes in this beautiful sleek case that captures everything in one package. So if you're in the market for an all-in-one, I do think the K9 Pro ESS is an excellent choice. Keep in mind that it does have shortcomings on coaxial and optical inputs, and that the switches on the front you're probably going to need to remember pretty quickly because they're impossible to read. But once you get past those couple of gripes or shortcomings, it's a wonderful device that looks great and works great and sounds fantastic at its price point. So if you're in North America and looking to buy one, I've got a link down below through to Appos where you can buy from them and also support the channel at the same time. Thank you to anyone that chooses to do that. And if you're outside North America, I'll try to find another link for a global supplier of the K9 Pro ESS. For now though, I hope you found this review useful. If you have, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe, ring the notification bell and hit the like button. I've got heaps and heaps of great new content coming. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound. So it is a nice addition having that